Welcome back to Washington Watch. I'm Joseph, back home sitting in for Tony today. Among the many high points from last week's Pray Vote Stand Summit was hearing the message from Southern Baptist Theological Seminary President Dr. Albert Mohler. While it was clear that the audience in attendance found his message inspiring, several of his comments drew criticism after going viral online.
2022 in the United States means votes matter. And we have a responsibility to make certain that Christians understand the stewardship of the vote, which means the discipleship of the vote, which means the urgency of the vote, the treasure of the vote. And they need to understand that insofar as they do not vote or they vote wrongly, they are unfaithful. Because the vote is a powerful stewardship. And we need to remind Christians of that. We need to remind Christians of what's at stake.
Dr. Mohler stood by his words, later tweeting, "If you are offended that I encourage Christians to vote for candidates who defend the unborn and support the integrity of marriage and to vote against candidates who support abortion and subvert marriage, that has been my message for my entire life." Now, did he speak out of bounds? Joining me now to discuss this in our Worldview segment that typically comes to you on Friday, but today it's a special edition on Monday, is David Closson. He's the director of the Center for Biblical Worldview at Family Research Council, and that can be found at frc.org/worldview. David, good to see you today.
Hey, good to see you as well, Joseph.
So we played the clip there. I believe you were actually there in person to hear it live. But one thing we can say is that Dr. Mohler's words were not taken out of context. He said exactly what he said. They, of course, drew criticism. Did you have any problem with it?
I did not have any problem with Dr. Mohler's remarks, and I was with him there down in Atlanta at our Pray Vote Stand Summit, which I thought was just a very encouraging event. And what Dr. Mohler said to our attendees there in Atlanta is something that he's been exhorting Christians for as long as I've known him. I'm a two-time graduate of Southern Seminary, so he's been my seminary president since I started my master's program back in 2014. And Dr. Mohler has been consistent, simply saying that Christians have a stewardship when it comes to the vote. And that's, I think, Dr. Mohler and others, Joseph, who've spoken about these things. The way I look at it is, as Christians, we're called to be faithful with everything God has entrusted us with, whatever that may be. But for those of us who live in the United States, where we live in a constitutional republic, how we steward our vote, how we steward our opportunities in the political system, that's something we should take very seriously, and that's all that Dr. Mohler was doing in Atlanta.
Now, David, I think one of the reasons that his comments received so much pushback was because he said, or he implied, but basically said, that it's possible for Christians to vote wrongly. And in a biblical sense, what do you make of this idea that it's possible to vote wrongly? And how does one know if they're about to cast a vote that would be, in God's eyes, wrong?
Yeah, it's a great question, Joseph. And I think this is where Christians need to think just deeply about politics and about what as Christians we're called to do. We need to be very honest. And what a blessing, Joseph, that we can even have this conversation. There are many Christians, and I've met some of them around the world, that don't have the political freedoms and opportunities that we have in this country. The very fact that we're having this conversation is a blessing. But I think it's important to realize, Joseph, that there's a lot of issues out there in the public square that the Bible does not necessarily speak to. I think that we can get biblical principles for pretty much almost every issue under the sun, but there are some issues where I think Christians can definitely come to the issue, discuss it, pray about it, and have different opinions. There's no "thus saith the Lord." There's no chapter and verse for a lot of issues that we can deal with. However, there are some issues, Joseph, that increasingly we realize there's a "thus saith the Lord." And the two issues that Dr. Mohler highlighted, marriage and the life issue, those are issues that the Bible speaks very clearly. We don't have to guess what God's opinion is on those issues. When it comes to marriage, Genesis 1 and 2, Matthew 19, those are verses that speak very clearly to the Bible's perspective on marriage. On the life issue, Psalm 139, Luke 1, and other passages, those speak very clearly that the Bible is pro-life. And increasingly, when we look at these different political races at the local level, the state level, and the federal level, there are candidates running for political office, one of which will have a very Bible position, so to speak, be very pro-life and pro-traditional marriage, pro-biblical marriage, and the other will be the antithesis of those. And I think that's where, as Christians, we need to realize what the context is and what issues are at play. Because increasingly, Joseph, the issues we're being asked to weigh in on are not ones on which the Bible is unclear, but actually very clear on.
In a lot of the concern is, and I know the argument you hear from many people when it comes to voting is, well, nobody's perfect. All the candidates are imperfect, and not all of them have perfect positions. Yeah, they might disagree with God on marriage and abortion, but this other person disagrees with God as they understand it on maybe a different issue. And we're going to talk about immigration in just a moment. But what would you say to somebody who's making the argument, well, they're all imperfect, so it's really just up to me to decide which version of imperfection I find most tolerable, and then just vote for them?
Yeah, and I would agree with that person, the hypothetical voter, that unless Jesus himself is on the ballot, we are always choosing between the lesser of two evils. Or we're choosing between sinful candidates. My encouragement is, let's look at the issues and let's look at the Bible. And, issues such as poverty. There's no candidate that's saying we want more poverty. Both political parties, the Republican Party and the Democrat Party in our context, want to alleviate poverty. But they'll have different approaches and different ideas on how to alleviate that. I think we just need to have an honest conversation. But Joseph, there's other issues, like I've already said, the life issue, where unfortunately one party increasingly wants unlimited abortion through all 9 months of pregnancy. Not just that, they want it to be funded and subsidized by taxpayers, whereas in many races, the other party, the Republican Party in recent years, is wanting to protect unborn children. And so I think we need to weigh the issues, and I think every voter needs to ask themselves the question, what issues is there a clear thus saith the Lord? What issues does the Bible speak most clearly? And I think that kind of having a triage, all issues matter, but some issues matter more. And we need to determine what issues does the Bible clearly tell us that we really need to care on.
Yeah, I think a helpful way to think about this is not necessarily becoming one-issue voters, but being people who understand the minimum qualifications for what it means to earn the vote of a Christian. And just because you disqualify someone doesn't obligate you to vote for someone else. But there should be a minimum benchmark of, we don't kill kids, and we agree with God's understanding. We don't take sides with the enemy in the sexual revolution. And if people do those things, I'm not going to vote for them. And maybe, hopefully, I can find someone else who, based on my conscience, is qualified. But we have to be quick to disqualify people who we know are fighting God's design for life in the world and in the created order that he created in Genesis chapter 1 and Genesis chapter 2. David, we could spend more time on that, but I'm not going to. We're quickly going to move on, because the other topic that we have actually started the show off with is this whole story of busing immigrants. And we know that there's a border crisis. 2 million people just this year have crossed the border, already more than 2021. And now the governors of states like Florida and Texas are sending them to other states, to blue states, up north that have not typically borne the burden of the immigration challenges at the border. And they have objected. They declared themselves to be sanctuary cities, but they objected to this. Now, a lot of people have called this and seen this as a political stunt, that they are using these peoples, these image bearers of God, as pawns in a political scheme. Do you see that happening? And as a result of that, does that mean it's unbiblical? The Christians should not support this effort to move people from southern states to northern states?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think why we have the Center for Biblical Worldview is we want to think biblically about all issues, including the issue of immigration. And on this issue, Joseph, kind of like I was alluding to in the last question, there's no thus saith the Lord on immigration policy. So we have to weigh this very carefully. I think what Ron DeSantis and Governor Abbott in Texas, they've definitely drawn a lot of attention to this issue. So you have the mayor of Chicago, mayor of New York City, people up in Martha's Vineyard, very liberal folks who have kind of been able to talk about this issue in theory and in the abstract, kind of virtue signal on the issue. Now all of a sudden when you have these immigrants being dropped off on their doorsteps, they're all of a sudden, it seems very, they're now very different in their tune, saying that they're not prepared to deal with this and we need to think about our immigration system. And so I think in one sense what the governors in the southern states have done is they've highlighted how broken our immigration system is. But the question you asked, Joseph, is this the most humane way to do it? And I think what you mentioned is key, Joseph, that as Christians we need to look at this first and foremost through the lens of all of the people that we're talking about right here are made in God's image. They have value, they have dignity. And so I don't know the heart motives of the governors of Texas and Florida, and if all of this is simply just a political stunt and they're turning these people into pawns, that's not what would be the most honoring way to handle, for image bearers. And so I think as Christians, we do need to think about how are these, it's good to draw attention to the immigration issue, but are we also doing this in a way that makes sure that we're not violating the dignity of people that are created in God's image and that He cares
David,
about?
And what we should establish at the beginning of this conversation is that if they are being abused, if they're being kidnapped, and these words are being thrown around online, and you take all that with a grain of salt, but this has been referred to as kidnapping and human trafficking, and I think that's not accurate. If that was happening, if people were at gunpoint being forced to get on buses and then be shipped someplace they didn't want to go, we would all come together and say that shouldn't happen. There's no evidence that I've seen that that's happening, but they are being put on buses and they are being taken other places, which to me begs the question, and what is also stipulated in this case, everybody agrees, these people have come into the country without legal authority to do so. They don't have any papers. They've essentially broken into the country. Now, we might say their motives are not bad in doing so. We might even sympathize with the circumstances under which they've done that, but they have broken into a country they're not from. When you do that, do you have the right to, and I think this is kind of the foundation of this question, do you have to have the right to demand how you are treated, or does the place that you break into have some discretion within the bounds of humanity, of course, to say, hey, well, you've come into our country, we're going to treat you with dignity, but we can't handle you here, or we're overwhelmed, we're going to take you someplace else. Isn't it reasonable for a migrant or somebody on behalf of the migrants to complain about the way that they are treated, within reason, of course, when you break into somebody's country?
Oh, I think so, Joseph. And the text that I immediately thought of when I was thinking about this story is Romans 13, verses 1 through 7 is kind of the most important text for how Christians think about what the role of a government is. It's been ordained, it's been instituted by God, and the government exists to do good, to restrain evil. And that's one of the reasons Christians have always said that we need to support law enforcement. We need to support the rule of law. And whereas those on the left don't seem to like to talk about it, it is true. When anyone enters this country illegally, they are breaking laws. And I've talked to people in Florida. That's my home state, Florida. I've talked to people in Texas, and you're absolutely right. I think the number is over 2 million folks in the last year and a half that have entered this country illegally. Cities on our southern border and other states, they are absolutely overwhelmed. And that, unfortunately, is leading to situations that are abysmal for some of these migrants. And so I think it is the point that you're making, Joseph, is I do think what the governor of Florida and the governor of Texas, they've done the country a favor in one sense by making sure that this issue is, again, front and center. Because, again, these are people that we're talking about. And I think as Christians, we should want a strong southern border, and we should want our nation to enforce its laws. Because if you don't have a nation that has laws being enforced, you have chaos. And that is certainly not the purpose of government, as Paul explains it in Romans 13.
David, I also want to highlight, I think, the goodness of the fact that we're even having this conversation. Because if we take this outside of an American context, what happens if you break into China, right? What do they do to you? There's a lot of countries where you're not treated nearly this graciously. And the fact that we have a cultural national ethic that recognizes human rights, that values human rights, that is an inherently Christian inheritance that we have, where we were founded on this idea that we all have value, that we were, and our rights come from us as image bearers of God. They're endowed to us by our Creator, human rights and legal rights that are constitutional. That as non-citizens, you don't have those, but all people have human rights that our government wants to recognize. That's an inherently Christian thing. And again, we would disavow abuse wherever we would find that. We don't see any evidence of that. And David, finally, to wrap this up, do the people who say, hey, you're being unbiblical in this case, do you think they actually care if you're being unbiblical?
I don't know the motives of the heart motives of people saying that, but studies we've done with George Barner shows only 6% of Americans have a biblical worldview, and so I think that most of the people making that argument are operating from a position where they're not seeing the lens through a biblical worldview. So I don't think that's what's going on there.
Yeah, and I think in many cases we see this where people in a political debate will say, hey, to two people who they know do care, people who identify as Christians, they'll say, hey, well, you're not being Christian there, and let me tell you what it means to be a Christian, let me tell you what it means to think biblically, when there's nothing about their life that evidences any interest in acting or thinking Christianly. And I would submit, as we close today, that those are the last people you should listen to understand what it is that God wants for you and for the world. David, thanks for your time today.
Thank you, Joseph.